Hello and welcome to this One Book, One Lincoln presentation. I'm Diane Gonzalez. The book all of Lincoln is reading and discussing this year is A Gentleman in Moscow, by the second novel by Amor Towles. It's the story of a Russian count who was sentenced in 1922 to house arrest in a luxurious hotel. This is the 16th year for the One Book, One Lincoln program, sponsored by Lincoln Public Libraries. And my guests today are going to help me talk about this book and the other finalists. David Smith is the chair of the selection committee. He's been on the committee for most of the lifespan of the One Book, One Lincoln program. And Katie Murtha is a librarian and the coordinator of the One Book, One Lincoln program. Thank you both so much for being here. Now, for those who've not yet finished the books we're going to talk about today, don't worry, we won't have any spoilers today. So, Katie, first of all, talk a little bit about the process. There were 96 different titles submitted. What happens from there?
Once we get the titles, we go and look and see if we can get them in different formats. It's absolutely critical that we get them in audio format and large print, and also electronic, both e-book and e-audiobook. So a lot of suggestions are kind of tossed out at that point simply because they were either out of print or we can't get them in multiple formats. But once we go through and kind of vet that list, then it goes to the selection committee and we just start reading. And we take about 2 or 3 books home the first week and come back and everybody kind of reports in on them.
A little bit more like 5 to 8 books over that first week. But
how many books did you read this year?
I read 22 books over the course of 8 weeks.
I was pretty close to that. Unfortunately, I kind of could see ahead of time which ones were going to make the list, and so I started reading a little bit in November and December, so I didn't have so many to read.
It's an 18-member selection committee that then comes up with the 3 finalists, and then you went back to voting this year.
Yes, we did. I had last year was my first year taking over as the coordinator for the One Book, One Lincoln program, and I had a lot of requests to go back to voting. So that was something that we kind of worked on and tried to figure out how we could do the programming around it. And I think so far, I think we've had a good success this year. I think it's important for people to have their voice and be able to make a vote. And I also think it encourages people to read all 3 books rather than just the winner.
And one of the things that I want to compliment Katie on was she decided to program for all 3 books over the summer. And so I think for people that were drawn to one book or another, it provided access that we hadn't had in the past for other programming for all people. So I think she's done a great job with that.
Well, interest was high, 377 votes. Let's talk about the 3 that were selected. We're going to start with the winner, A Gentleman in Moscow. And this is a novel that tells the story of Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov. Katie, tell us kind of the synopsis of how this all happened.
So he's a man who's really kind of living in 2 centuries. He's an aristocrat, and he gets sentenced in 1922 to a life of house arrest for being an unrepentant aristocrat by a Bolshevik court. So the place where he's living is this fancy hotel called the Metropole. It's an actual hotel in Moscow, so if you want to, you could go get a reservation.
It's right across the street from the Kremlin,
I
understand.
It's across the street from the Kremlin. And so he starts off with this beautiful suite, and then when he gets sentenced, they move him up to this small little garret in the attic, and he has to find a purpose in his life. And because he's an aristocrat, he knows a lot about food and dining and mixing people and doing settings, who can sit next to each other and have a good conversation. And so he eventually becomes a head waiter at this fancy hotel. And he meets the people in the hotel. Since he can't leave the hotel, his life revolves around the people that he meets. And so there's a lot of really interesting characters that you meet in this story. And one of them is this really charming little girl. And she kind of pilfers one of the pass keys to the hotel, and so she starts out with adventures with him, and they go through all these different rooms in the basement, and he actually gets back into his old suite at one point. And then her father moves away, and she moves away, but she comes back into his life several years later, and she's got little girl with her, and her husband has been sent to Siberia, and she doesn't have anybody else, and she asks him, can you watch my daughter while I go to Siberia? And she expects to be back in a month, and she's never heard from again. So then he becomes, you know, at like 50, he becomes a father, and he has to raise this little girl, and he gets to the point where he realizes you know, he has an opportunity to get her out of the Soviet Union, and that's kind of where the story goes. But it's about him finding a purpose in life, and it's about his interactions with all these other people that he might not have met or really interacted with had he not been forced to live in this hotel and kind of lose the social standing that he had as an aristocrat. And there's lots of really interesting settings that take place in this fancy restaurant. So if you like food, there's just and the one thing I really love about this book is he kind of sets up, you don't really realize it until I went back and reread it, but there's all kinds of little foreshadowing here and there. And in the end, he's dropped all these little hints, and in the end, he pulls it all together.
Don't tell us. Don't tell us.
It's also a very playful book. There's, I jokingly say it's a little bit like Eloise meets the Communist Party, if you're familiar with the Eloise books that children read. But there's a real playfulness all the way through, although there are also very serious notes along the way.
I like this description. A life sentence leads to personal growth and greater empathy. It just sounds like a really fascinating book. What do we know about the author, Amor Towles? This is his second novel?
This is his second novel. He had quite a bit of popular acclaim with the first that I can't tell
Rules
you
of
the title.
Civility.
Thank
Rules
you.
of Civility.
Thank you.
And he was financial in the financial field, and he would go and travel quite a bit. And he talks about one of the ideas for this book came because he had gone back to a hotel for like the 10th year, and he started to recognize, you know, people that were at the hotel, and he started to wonder, like, what would it be like to actually live in a hotel?
Interesting. Well, the book was on the New York Times bestseller list for over 20 weeks. It sounds like a great read. So let's move on to the other finalists now. One of the finalists is Moonglow by Michael Chabon. And David, tell us a little bit about this book and why you like this one.
Well, actually, Chabon is one of my favorite authors. The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay is one of my top 5 books of all time, so I really appreciate him as an author. Moonglow, though very clearly says Moonglow, a novel, reads really like a memoir, and it begins with Mike Chabon telling the story of his grandfather as he sits at his deathbed. He's dying of cancer, and he says, I've learned more about 90% about my grandfather in the past 10 days as he's been dying than I knew about him my whole life along the way. And so it's really a story that jumps back and forth in time to learn about his grandfather's story, who starts out as sort of a delinquent, a very poor family. He's a little bit out of control. He ends up going into the military and becoming a high-tech sniper and spy during World War II. He becomes an engineer. He becomes fascinated with the beginnings of space travel along the way and becomes a pretty important part of that. And then it also tells the story of his relationship with his wife, and the Mike Chabon's mother was actually the daughter of another man, but the grandfather adopts her, takes her in as her own. But the mother has a severe mental disability, as we'd probably classify her as bipolar, and so sort of moves in and out of periods of clarity along the way. And she was a Jewish refugee from World War II that ends up in the United States. And they actually meet as a result of being in synagogue together. And so there's also this very interesting and complicated love story between the grandfather and the grandmother along the way.
It sounds like a kind of a sweeping epic, but also very intimate.
Yes. Yes, yes, and sort of a path into we probably all know those types of men who are very stoic most of their lives, that don't share much, and yet once you begin to find out one of those people's stories, you find out just how passionate they can be, and what an interesting and complicated life that they've led along the way.
Well, Michael Chabon is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. The other finalist is by a newcomer.
This is her first debut novel.
First debut novel. It's called Homegoing. It's by Jesse.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about Homecoming and what makes it special.
Yeah. Homegoing
is,
I think it's a really interesting book in that it's quite different the way it's set up. It's the story of two half-sisters. They were born in Ghana in the 1700s, and they don't know each other. They've never met each other. And one sister ends up the wife of a British governor in this, they call it the castle, but it's really a building that on the top of it is like a castle, and in the basement there's a dungeon, and that's where the slaves are brought before they're shipped across to America. So the other half sister ends up being caught and in the dungeon. So the one sister's living above, living the upstairs life, and then the downstairs life is the other sister who's in the dungeon, and she is sent to America. And so it's the storylines, and then it goes to each descendant. There's 7 generations, so the book kind of toggles between these two sisters and their descendants. So each part is almost like a short story. I mean, there's a definite narrative arc to each descendant's story, but it is a novel. I mean, it isn't separate short stories. They all kind of come together in the next generation. You see the scars, I guess, from the previous generation adds to the next generation. So it's quite interesting because it's like, what if I was what if I was sent to America? This is what would happen to my family and my life, or what if I stayed in Ghana? So one of the things that she talks about for the family that stays in Ghana was how complicit a lot of the tribes were in selling other tribes to the British, and being a part of the slave trade. And I guess I hadn't realized the extent of that. And then for the American side, I mean, she goes through the slavery, and then she goes through the Jim Crow era, and then there's a character that gets basically sentenced to like slave labor almost because he can't pay a court fee. So he ends up as a prisoner, and then you have the Great Migration. So one character ends up in Harlem and tries to be a jazz singer, and then it goes to the crack epidemic in the 1980s. So you kind of get a lot of history of kind of things that were going on while, and then, in the end there's kind of a resolution, I will say, but it's an interesting kind of, this is what would have happened if I had stayed in Africa, or this might have been my life if I had come to the United States. And she's an interesting author in that she was born in Ghana, but grew up in the United States. So she talks about not really belonging to any really group. She's doesn't really feel like African American in the sense that she doesn't have the same cultural touchstones that most of African Americans have. But and I can't remember where there's a word for it. Where you're too far removed from Africa to really be an African, So she talks about that too. So it's talking about home, what home is, and then homegoing is, the idea of there was like a ceremonial where someone died, they believed their soul would go back. If they were early a slave, their soul would go back to Africa, and so there's homegoing ceremonies now that I would say be similar to what a funeral would be.
Well, they seem like 3 novels that all sort of have one foot in reality. Is that one of the things that made them appealing to the committee?
I think so, and I think they appeal to very different readers as well. I think Moonglow is probably one of the books we've done in the last few years that could really appeal to a male audience along the way. I think they all can appeal to male and female, but I think there's a definite sort of male appeal there. The episodic nature of Homegoing is very appealing to some readers. The Michael Chabon book reads a lot like John Irving, if there's John Irving fans, where lots of flashbacks and you jump around in the story, but always come back to the main storyline along the way. And then A Gentleman in Moscow is just a nice, straight narrative read through the generations with a lot of appealing, sympathetic characters along the way.
And what do you think made the three stand out?
I think Gentleman in Moscow has a really broad appeal. He also he brings in a lot of art, a lot of music, a lot of Russian literature. So if you have any background in any of that, you're recognizing it as you're reading it. And like I said, he drops a lot of foreshadowing that I didn't necessarily catch until I went back and reread it the second time, and then I was like, oh, okay, you can see it coming. But there's a lot of really appealing characters in this. It's kind of character driven in his interactions with different characters, brings out a different part of the Count. So I think that one was really interesting. I really enjoyed Homegoing as well, because you're kind of toggling between these two lines, and there's a family tree in the beginning of that book, and for anybody who's reading it, I would recommend finding the family tree, and I actually put a little tab and I would go back and, okay, where am I? Because eventually when you get to the end, or towards the end, it's a little bit easier, okay, this story's set in America, so this is the line that I'm following, or this, but at the beginning it's kind of hard to keep up with all the characters because there's quite a few, but if you have that family tree, that's very helpful. And yeah, no, I loved the Moonglow too. I thought that was really interesting. I loved the story of the grandfather and the grandmother, and he wanted to kind of rescue her in a lot of ways, and that's pretty kind of there was inside. He's kind of a little bit of a rascal, but inside I think there's a little bit of a noble character there.
Yeah.
Well, Katie, as David mentioned, you've got some special programming planned. There's a couple coming up in September we want to talk about, and one in November. Just briefly tell us about the three that are on the schedule. Harlem Renaissance, of course. One of Lincoln's great vocalists, Annette Muriel, is going to be performing, and that would tie more into Homegoing.
Homegoing. There's a character that specifically goes from the South as a part of the Great Migration to Harlem with the idea that she wants to be a jazz singer. And so Annette Muriel is our jazz singer. She's going to do kind of her interpretations of Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, who were two really prominent jazz singers from that time frame. So that's coming. It's going to be this Sunday, the 17th at 3 p.m. at Bennett Martin in the auditorium on the 4th floor.
The next two then deal with A Gentleman in Moscow. One is about dining, which you had mentioned earlier. This is going to be at the Walt Branch September 21st. Fine dining, pairing food with wine, and all those little tidbits that are in the book. We have a professor from UNL who specializes in hospitality, and he's actually bringing some of his students as well. So they're going to kind of, I think, set up a table, and hopefully we'll get a couple of volunteers to sit at the table, and he's going to kind of go through, what is fine dining, because for most of us, I don't think we really, we're kind of that casual eating. The experience of fine dining is going to talk about what it is. In this book, the Count before he becomes a head waiter, he kind of tells this young couple at the next table, well, I would pair this wine with this food or whatever. So you get a lot of there's a lot of scenes set in this restaurant, so I think that's going to be a really interesting tie-in to what is fine dining and pairing food and wine, and what to do with your napkin and when you're finished and those kinds of things. Yeah, the third program deals more with the history of the Soviet Union, and that's coming up on November 5th. Life Outside the Metropole, which he did not get to do.
Well, no, and there's one scene in here where he has to take his daughter to a hospital, and it's been several years since he's left the Metropole, and he suggests going to this hospital that was at the time the premier hospital, and when he gets there, he realizes it's no longer. It was a religious hospital, so it's, you know, under the Bolsheviks, it's no longer the premier hospital, and he realizes how much time has changed. And the only way he really knows that is through the characters that that he meets that are coming in and out of the Metropole. So we have Dr. Marceline Hutton, who's going to be coming, and she's a Russian scholar, and she's going to be talking about what really happened in the Soviet Union in the 20s and 30s. That's kind of her area of specialty. So,
David, these special programs, they really help support the goal of the program, which is getting discussion going.
Absolutely. And that really is our goal, is to put books out there that generate excitement, but also generate thoughtfulness and experiences that people may not have had before. And A Gentleman in Moscow certainly does that. I'm going to divert a little bit here, but one of the things that I really like about Count Rostov is that you assume that as a count he is probably a little snooty, a little standoffish, and instead you have this character that is genuinely curious about people and generous beyond means, and doesn't take into account whatever their social standing is. He's as friendly to the wait staff and desk clerks and maids as he is to those people that are coming in and out as guests of the hotel. And there's a real compassion in that character, and well worth the read just for that, especially in this time.
He's a real gentleman.
He's a real gentleman.
A real gentleman. Well, let's talk a little bit about the website and the resources people can find on that. I know there's resources for book groups. You do book club in a bag. You mentioned all the formats available as well.
Yeah, there's several different formats. One of the things that we offer, if you have a book club or just a group of friends that want to get together and read a book, you can contact the library, and we will send a library staff out to help facilitate a book discussion. So in fact, I'm going to a Homegoing one tonight. And that's something I really enjoy. It's so much fun to talk to different people because everybody brings out different things that you haven't thought of. And in fact, there was a quote at the beginning of Moonglow, and it was attributed to Wernher von Braun, and someone said, do you think he really did? And we started Googling it, and it was the dark side. It was from the dark side of the moon too. So I don't know who wrote it first, if it was really an actual Wernher von Braun quote or if it was from a song. But I wouldn't have picked up on that, on my own. So that's always so much fun to talk to other people and see what they've picked up on.
David, you've been involved with this program for a dozen years now. What keeps you interested in it?
It's just exciting to see what gets nominated every year, because it is such a broad range of reading selections that are out there. And I could easily just get caught up in my own little world of reading and my own interests. And instead I get to read things as a result of this that I wouldn't probably choose just on my own. And we have a wonderful committee that we have very lively discussions about the books and about the community, and thinking about the goals who our reading community is, how we can draw more people into that community, and what we want people to think about currently.
And I would say too, if anybody's interested in being on the committee, we're always looking for new committee members. We have people are usually on it for 3 years. If you get on it and you don't want to be on it, we can get off of it. But most people who join the committee are really sad when their 3 years are up. But we're always looking for new people and new voices, and we're trying to get a diverse range of voices within the community. So if you're interested, just go ahead and contact the library, and I take names, and we start going through in December and looking at who's rotating off and how many spots we have available, and we'll contact you and see if you're still interested.
All right. LincolnLibraries.org is the website where you can find out all the different resources about the One Book, One Lincoln program. You can sign up for email alerts, find out about discussion groups. Katie will come to your house and lead a discussion group. And then all the formats are available there as well. So lincolnlibraries.org is the website for all the information about One Book, One Lincoln. Thank you both so much for joining me, and we'll be back in a year from now with the 17th year. It's hard to believe. It's been a long time, but it's been a great 17 years.
Very good.
Yeah.
I've read some books that I wouldn't have read otherwise. So thank you both very, very much. I want to encourage everyone to read A Gentleman in Moscow, as well as the two finalists, Moonglow and Homegoing. I'm Diane Gonzalez, and thank you for joining us for this One Book, One Lincoln presentation.